Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Lisette Mendez. I'm the Programs Director for the Miami Book Fair. We have a very special live stream for you, and I would like to start by giving thanks to Mitchell Kaplan and Christina Nosti of our partner bookstore, Books and Books, as well to all of my hardworking colleagues at Miami Book Fair. I want you all to take note of this bar right under my head. It's a link to Books and Books where you can purchase The Last Train to Key West, Chanel Cleeton's new novel. But also you can purchase from Books and Books all of Renee Rosen's books as well as Chanel's previous works. I've posted links to the collection of books by Renee's books as well as Chanel's books up on the chat, but I'll add those links again a little bit later on today. And without too much more ado, I want to introduce you to Chanel and Renee. Originally from Florida, Chanel Cleeton grew up on stories of her family's exodus from Cuba following the events of the Cuban Revolution. Her passion for politics and history continued during many years spent studying in England. And even though she received her Juris Doctor from the University of South Carolina School of Law, she transformed that passion for history and politics and family stories into novels. In addition to the book we'll be talking about tonight, The Last Train to Key West, Chanel has two other books that are loosely related. And one of them was chosen by Reese Witherspoon for her book club. That was next year in Havana. And her other book in this family of books about the Perez family is When We Left Cuba. She'll be in conversation tonight with another best-selling author of historical fiction, Renee Rosen, who lives in Chicago and where she's now at work on a new novel titled Distortional Graces. And it's a story about Mrs. Astor and Mrs. Vanderbilt vying for control of New York society during the Gilded Age. Again, I want to thank you all for being here tonight, taking part in this conversation. Any questions that you have, put them right under here in the Ask a Question dialog box. And I'm going to bring Chanel and Renee up on the stage or the screen for tonight's event. Thank you.
Hi, thank you all so much for coming this evening. I am Chanel Cleeton. I'm the author of The Last Train to Key West, which is my newest book. And I have to give this cover a shout out because my publisher, Berkeley Publishing, always does the best covers. And that's definitely something I look forward to every time I have a new book to see what their art department comes up with. Thank you so much to Books and Books and to the Miami Book Fair for having me. I have a really special place in my heart for Books and Books. The first solo book event I ever did was in Books and Books, and my family lives in Florida, so it's always nice because they get to come down to the events and get to hear me talk. And I love meeting all of you and hearing your stories and hearing about how the books resonate with you. Miami obviously has a really special place in my heart. It's the first place my family came after they came from Cuba. And so it's just always a really wonderful experience. I'm sad that I can't be there in person this year, but I am so happy to be able to have this virtual event with all of you and to talk about the book and to share your thoughts. And I'm also so thrilled to be in conversation with my good friend, Renee Rosen. Renee is a fabulous author of historical fiction, and I absolutely adore her work. Her most recent novel, Park Avenue Summer, is just the perfect summer read. It's smart, it's fun, it's fabulous, just like Renee. And definitely is one of my favorite historical fiction books. So I'm so excited for this conversation tonight and just so happy to be here. Thank you all so much for joining us.
Well, I am thrilled to be part of this and to help launch this book for your fans. And, this book has been one of the most anticipated novels of the summer. Bustle has listed it as that. BookBub says a perfect, riveting summer read. Publishers Weekly says Cleeton finds the right balance of historical detail and suspense. And I think magazine, Oprah, said it best when she says, "The Last Train to Key West is a feast for readers across multiple genres." This book has it all. Great characters, a compelling historical backdrop, quest for love. And for me, when I was reading it, and I got an advanced copy and my coveted advanced reader copy. And as I was reading it, that's what really struck me, is that you really got all these, there's romance, there's suspense, there's the rich historical detail. And I'm just curious how you describe this book.
So the book is set in 1935, and it's the story of three women whose lives intersect over Labor Day weekend, when the Labor Day hurricane hit the Florida Keys. And their lives intersect in really unexpected ways as they're faced with both the danger of the storm and also some dangerous circumstances surrounding them.
And you have a lot of different elements at play here in this book. So you've got, let's say, we've got the hurricane, we've got Labor Day weekend, there's the vets, there's the story of these three women. And I'm curious, what came first for you? Did you have the idea of the hurricane, or was it these three women? And how did all that come together for you?
So it was the hurricane that really came to me first. And it was interesting because my previous two historical fiction books dealt with political events, the Cuban Revolution and its aftermath. And I had never written a book about a natural disaster. But it was hurricane season a few years ago. I was finishing up writing When We Left Cuba. And I just came across an article on hurricanes that had affected the state of Florida, and came across the Labor Day hurricane of 1935. And what really struck me when I read about the storm was that, as I mentioned, I'm originally from Florida. I grew up in the state. And for as devastating as the storm was, and for as much of an impact as it had on the region, it was a storm I'd never heard of before. And as I learned about the veterans who were sent down to the Keys to work on the overseas railroad, and how many of them perished because they were not evacuated properly, I really knew that it was a story I wanted to tell. There were a lot of really interesting cultural intersections between the United States and Cuba at that time, with Henry Flagler's overseas railroad. And there was just a lot that kind of stuck with me. And that's how I know when I want to write a book. It's when that idea just kind of stays with you and you keep thinking about it and what sort of people would populate that story.
Yeah. And how did you stumble upon the Flagler Railroad and the highway? Because I had never heard of that before. And he was a really fascinating guy, too.
He is, yes. And growing up in Florida, you definitely see his name in a lot of places. He was really influential in building the state, but I wasn't as familiar with our overseas railroad either. And it was such a fascinating concept to me. Basically, you could take a railroad down from New York to Key West, and then in Key West, you could just hop a ferry and you would be in Havana rather in a short amount of time. And I was just really fascinated that that was possible back then. And of course, now when you drive down to the Keys, you can see the remnants of the railroad off in the distance. But it was just such an interesting event and such an interesting thing to write about. It was kind of colloquially known as one of the wonders of the world. And so it definitely inspired me as I was working on the book.
Yeah. And really, at the heart of this novel are the stories of three women, and they're very different. And you've got Helen, Mirta, and Elizabeth, and their lives they're all on the cusp of some sort of monumental change in their lives going into this holiday weekend. And I'm curious if you sort of anticipated how the hurricane was going to impact their lives, or if there hadn't been a hurricane on that particular weekend, how do you think these women would have, sort of moved through this? Because, and just like at the start of the book, they're all attached to either men that they don't love or men that they don't really know, and then the hurricane kind of mixes it all up. So I'm just curious how that played. It's almost like a character in the book itself.
Yes. I mean, that's something I like to play with in my writing. Setting is also something I kind of use as almost a character in the book. I mean, it really often my settings drive the story. And I'm really drawn to the story of kind of ordinary people who are caught in extraordinary circumstances, whose lives are upended by the unexpected and often uncontrollable. And so that was something with the storm. I really saw it as kind of a driver for a lot of the action in the book. And I think you bring up a great point about, would these characters have ended up together? Would they have been happy together had they not lived through this event? And I think, as we all look at life, there's so many times in your life that circumstances kind of dictate and change your course completely. And so I really enjoyed exploring that and seeing how my characters reacted to the storm, how they maybe went into the situation with certain preconceived notions, and how, this one event changed a lot of that for them.
Sort of forced their hand a little bit in certain areas.
Yes. And it was interesting too, because, and sorry, I realize I have the sun on my face, but I'm in this corner of my office. There's nowhere else I can move. So I apologize. But it was interesting working with this timeline, because it's really the majority of the book takes place over Labor Day weekend. Mm-hmm. And so their lives and all of these things are so driven by the timeline of the storm, of what they knew at the time, of what the weather conditions were like. It really kind of moved the characters around in the book in terms of where they could be at certain places and how they would react to those situations.
Yeah. And it really builds so much suspense in the book as you're reading, because that storm is coming and you see the weather, but you don't know how it's going to play out. And so, I just thought that was a wonderful element, and just really kept the pacing going. And because the more you get into it, the more you're like, oh God, it's coming. So,
and it was interesting going through the research and realizing how much these poor people were given incorrect information. They would be told the storm's going to hit here, and they would make preparations, and then it would change really quickly. And looking at it from the benefit of a modern viewpoint, I thought about what it's like, now with modern hurricane tracking and the kind of information we get, and it's certainly stressful enough nowadays, but imagining back then how kind of flawed a lot of those systems were, the lack of communication, and how they really had to just rely on themselves. And we're in this very narrow, difficult place to actually evacuate. I mean, the Keys themselves are very geographically unforgiving for a hurricane like this. And so that definitely affected the story as well.
Yeah. And I want to circle back to the women for a second. At one point, Elizabeth says that Mirta kind of reminds her of herself. And I'm curious, the women are all clearly very different, and yet they're similar. And how do you see them as similar? How do you see them as different? And I know when I'm writing from different character point of views, I get attached to one, maybe just a little bit. So was there one character that you couldn't wait to get back to her storyline?
So in terms of the character, I would definitely say Helen for me, not as much that I couldn't wait to get back to her storyline, but she really was the voice of the book for me. Her voice came to me first, and that's why her chapters bookend the book. Helen is a native of the Keys. She lives in Key West. She's a waitress. She is pregnant. She's in an abusive marriage, and she's very much looking for a way out of her life. She's a character who is incredibly strong. I think she doesn't always believe in herself necessarily, but I found her to be very relatable. Obviously, the Great Depression plays a big role in this book, and she's someone who's been knocked down repeatedly by life and is very much hoping for something different and hoping for change. And so her story really resonated with me, and her voice was the strongest in my head. That said, I found all three women to be really fascinating to work with. You're right, they do have a lot of similarities, but I also found ways that they were different, and they all come from very different backgrounds. And so I liked kind of exploring how the Depression would have impacted each of them differently. I liked exploring how they were going to relate to the storm. One thing I realized was Elizabeth, being from New York, was going to have a different reaction to the hurricane than Helen and Mirta, who had been through storms before and had that experience. And so it was really interesting kind of being in their head and seeing how they reacted to the events.
Yeah. And, as I was reading too, there's so many really rich themes that run through this book. And two that sort of jumped out at me. One is there's definitely a theme of danger. There's danger with the hurricane. There's danger with potential partners. We've got some mafia action going on. I mean, there's lots of that, and desperate times that sort of to desperate acts. And then because of the danger, there's also a theme of protection, where Helen is protecting her unborn child, John is protecting Helen, Anthony is protecting Mirta. You know, there's this sort of protective nature of those that you love. And I'm curious, just are you aware of your themes going in? Like, these are things I'm going to touch upon, or is it sort of a discovery for you through the writing process?
That's a really good question. I will be honest, it's not something I think I think about as much, but I think as writers, we all kind of have that inner voice that we go back to, and there's certain themes that certainly recur through our books that we're drawn to. And for me, sacrifice is definitely a big theme. I like to write about characters who are challenged, who are often stepping outside of their comfort zone, who are having to see things from a different perspective, or who are having to react to circumstances that come their way. And so I think that's a theme you really see in a lot of my books. Certainly as well, you know, romantic relationships and really any kind of emotional connection between characters is really important to me. And that's something I always love to write about and to explore. You know, you mentioned the mafia element, and that was actually kind of a storyline that really came out as I was writing the book. I didn't intend for that part to play as much of a role, but when I started doing research and really, you know, I think I went into this book with a little bit of a romanticized view of the Keys before I started doing research. You know, we all have this image of this bucolic paradise where you can go down for, you know, a getaway. And as I started researching what it was like during the Great Depression and realizing that Prohibition had just ended, so you had all these rum runners that were down there who now were kind of looking for new enterprises, the connections of smuggling with Cuba. I began to really realize that the image of the Keys that I went into with the book was not really the image of what it was like back then. And so that drove a lot of the story for me, and it actually ended up driving a lot of the plot. I'm not a big plotter before I start writing a book, and what I yield in my research tends to be what really drives the story. I like to use history as much as possible to form my plots. Sorry, I think you just cut out. Oh, okay, I can hear you now.
So, you know, prior to Next Year in Havana, you were a successful romance writer. And I think that was, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I would think that would be great training for writing the historical, from using a historical perspective, but bringing in that connection between your characters. Because I think you do such a great job of making those personal connections, and I wonder if that comes out of sort of the training that you got writing, you know, primarily about relationships.
An impact in my work. I do love writing about relationships, and I do find that kind of at the heart of everything, it's that human element that really drives my stories.
Do such a beautiful job of it, and you know, it brings me back to like how you connected the vets and their story with the women, because I thought you did such a wonderful job of bringing those two elements together. And I'm just curious, like, you know, I'm sort of fascinated by your process and how you get there. And, you know, so when do you outline? Do you have any sense? Do you let the story just sort of unfold for you? You know, how many drafts do you do?
That's a great question. I would say the most consistent thing about my process is that it varies from book to book. With this book in particular, I really started off with this basic idea. And I know my editor's on the chat, and I have to say she's always so kind, because I'll give her like this really, really sketchy idea that's, you know, not fully formed. And she's always so nice and is like, run with it. You know, she was really great about trusting me and understanding that my process really comes out when I'm working on the book. And that's where the plot and the characters really fully take shape for me. With this book, I will be honest, I did not front load the research. So I sort of researched as I wrote. After this book, I stopped doing that because I learned that it was a little bit more difficult in the drafting process. particularly because as I mentioned, this is such a short timeline. And so really, I almost had like an hour by hour countdown of, okay, this could not happen in the plot because this is where the weather conditions were at this moment. So it was a really tight story to write.
That added a whole layer of
It did.
to
It
it.
did. Yes. And I've never written a book on this short of a time frame. So it was really interesting. Usually my books take place over, a year or two. And so you have a little bit more room to maneuver. But this was challenging, which I do love about writing. I mean, there's always something new when you're working on a book. And this was definitely unique in that. But really, the characters drive my story for me. So I started writing the book. I knew who Helen was. I knew that I was going to have Mirta, who is a Perez, and I wanted to have that Cuban connection in my book. I've very much fallen in love with this family that I've been writing about for the past 2 books. And so I love this idea of sort of following these ancestors through history. So I knew that I wanted to bring in that Cuban connection and to learn a little bit more about that side of my heritage and my history. And then I knew with Elizabeth, I wanted to show the impact that the Depression had had on women, particularly with her coming from the city. Her family worked on Wall Street. They were affected by the Great Crash. And so, once I knew who the characters were, they really brought out the story for me as I was writing. The only thing I will say that's really consistent about my writing process is that I write with Scrivener. I find it to be really helpful. It's a program that you can use on your computer. And for historical fiction, it's really great because I often work with multiple timelines and multiple characters, and you can really easily kind of move things around, and you can put all your research there. A lot of what we do, yes, the research is very helpful. A lot of what we do is so research heavy that being able to kind of reference that when you're in the manuscript is very helpful.
Compiling's a bit of a nightmare, but I don't know if you find that.
It is. Yeah. Yeah, I edit in Word, so I definitely go through, trying to compile this story. But it's become kind of my comfort thing to do now, so I really like to use that program.
So you had just touched upon this a little bit, but I'm curious of how your heritage obviously impacts your writing and your work. And I'm curious about maybe something that you've learned or new things that you've learned about your heritage, doing the research and going back and writing about the Perez family and Cuba and that time period and all.
It's been a really interesting process. So all of my books, and we referenced about how I wrote romance before, I always take from my personal life. I always have something that is kind of a connection between me and the characters. I find that with writing, that's really helpful because whenever you get stuck in the story, you can see parts of yourself in those characters, and it's a great way to kind of bring yourself back and to relate to them. So writing about my heritage was, I think, kind of a natural evolution. When I started working on Next Year in Havana, it was really probably the most personal book I've written because it was so inspired by my relationship with my grandmother and my family's heritage and the stories I had grown up on. So it was definitely a really powerful book for me. And at the time, I thought that was going to be it. I really didn't envision writing more books in the vein. But then, of course, as I've said before, I met Beatrice and knew I wanted to tell her story. So then I wrote When We Left Cuba. And that book was interesting, too, because my characters had a little bit of a divergence from my family's experience. My family didn't come to the United States till 1967, whereas my fictional family came much earlier. So while I was writing the book, I was writing from the perspective of a family in the United States, whereas my family was still in Cuba for the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Bay of Pigs and all those events. But it was still really interesting to talk to my grandfather and to hear what those experiences were like for him. And it's definitely opened up a dialogue in my family. I think a lot of Cuban Americans of my generation, we grew up on all of these stories and these memories and this passion that our family has for their homeland. My grandparents lived with us, so it was very much kind of a daily part of my life. But at the same time, they talked a lot about the good memories of Cuba, and I didn't hear as much about some of the darker times, like the revolution and some of the things that they experienced. So writing these books has really opened up that dialogue. And, my grandmother's gone now, but my grandfather, as he's older, it's really amazing and special to me to be able to still, hear these stories and to preserve them. And as I continue writing, I'm really following this family through history. So I'm opening myself up to parts of Cuban history that I didn't know much about. With this book, I touch a little bit on the Revolution of 33. And it just gave me this renewed perspective of all that my family had been through. Everything is so obviously defined by the Revolution in 59 that I didn't fully appreciate how much turmoil there was just a little bit before that. And I have another book that's even going back further in time. And I've just learned so much about my history that I didn't know that's really fascinating.
I wanted to ask you, where are you going to next? What's up next?
So I'm so excited about my next book. And I just have to tease, I talked about covers earlier. My publisher did the cover for this one, and it's amazing. I think it's actually my favorite cover. So I'm really excited to share it. I think we'll be able to share it in the coming months. But the title is called The Most Beautiful Girl in Cuba. And it is set during the Gilded Age and the Spanish-American War. And it's inspired by the true story of Evangelina Cisneros. She was a Cuban woman who was involved in the fight for independence against Spain. And she was falsely imprisoned by the Spanish. She was just 18 years old, well, 19 when she was in prison, but she was falsely imprisoned by the Spanish, and she sort of became this international celebrity. There was a big war in New York City for newspaper dominance at the time between Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst. And Hearst really championed her cause and made her this figurehead in an attempt to get the United States involved in the war with Spain. So the book is really about her life. There's two other heroines. One of them is a member of the Perez family, and about this fight for Cuban independence from Spain. And it was a period of history I really was not very familiar with. And it's just been so fascinating and also very sobering. It was definitely a difficult time period in Cuba. So the research has been very emotional, but I'm just so thrilled with the book. We just finished edits, and I'm really proud of it. It was an amazing book to work on.
Sounds like a ton of research too.
It was my most research heavy book. I read easily north of 100 and something sources on it, like full books. And Scrivener was my lifesaver because I had so many characters. And I'm one of those people, like my editors on this is listening. I get really, like, with historical fiction, I have a really hard time deviating from the historical record. And so I think I probably know everything about this woman that's been published. And still, I felt like it wasn't enough. And my editor would be like, I think it's okay. Like, we can probably just extrapolate a little bit here. But I just couldn't get off, the fact that I needed to make sure, I had as much information about her as possible. So I think we're hopefully, I think I've read everything that's out there. But it was a really fascinating book. I didn't appreciate the Gilded Age, hijinks as much until I started researching it. And some of the stories, I was like, my author's note is going to have to be pretty in-depth because people are not going to believe that this actually happened and is historically accurate. So, and I know Renee is also working on a Gilded Age book, so we're excited for that. Hers is out next year, right?
Yeah, right around the same time. So hopefully we'll be doing something. So.
Yes, we're hoping we can tour together or something. It's always fun when you can do that with someone else. So.
I want to just circle back to the current book, especially as we go into hurricane season. And I know you said that you draw on a lot of personal experiences. The scenes of the actual hurricane are so real. You can feel the danger and the fury of the storm. And so did any of that come from, have you been through, hurricanes yourself, having grown up, in Miami and all, how were you able to capture that so realistically?
I've been fortunate. I've sort of lived all over the state. I've lived in North Florida, South Florida, and then Central. I've been fortunate to not be directly hit by a hurricane. I have definitely been through a lot of the, will it hit us? Do we need to evacuate? What kind of preparations do we need to make? And when I was writing the book, that was definitely something I thought about a lot, is kind of how that uncertainty, I think psychologically, just sort of weighs on you, and how it, just really is kind of very disruptive in this short amount of time period where you're waiting to see if your life is upended. I was a little girl when Andrew hit, and I remember hearing about the storm and the aftermath and the huge impact that it had. And certainly, I think, being from Florida, hurricanes are just such a specter kind of looming when it's hurricane season. So it was really sobering to write And especially just to think about what it was like back in the 30s and what that experience would have been like.
Yeah. The sort of communication and the technology to track storms like we have now. So I just captured that so beautifully. And
thank you.
You know, it was so vivid. And I do see that we have a couple questions in the queue. So I don't know if we want to. I don't know. There was some questions. There she is.
Yes. Hi, guys. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to ask the questions so that if anyone has any additional questions, please put them in the Ask a Question box. So I'm going to start with a question that got 3 upvotes. And this is a question from Lorraine. She's talking about the cover and how beautiful it is. And she was wondering if the sunflowers on the dress on the book cover are intentional in light of peaceful protests that took place in Cuba on October 1st, 2019. A number of human rights activists, including Jose Daniel Ferrer, marched with sunflowers in hand to demand human rights. Was that part of the reason for that dress, Chanel?
That wasn't, and I can't take credit for picking the dress. That was very much the art department. But I love that sentiment, and I wasn't aware of that. So thank you for sharing that. I love to know that it has that connection. I'm not sure if that was something the art department did. They very much come up with the covers with their own inspiration. I wish I was talented in artistic design and expression, but I'm not. So I often will kind of give them an idea of what I'd like to see for the book, but very much their talents bring these covers to life, and they always do such an amazing job. I'm really fortunate that they've captured the spirit of the book so beautifully.
Well, actually, a couple of our audience members want the covers to be sold as a poster set. So we'll pass that note along to the art department. So we have another question from Lorraine and a question from Melissa that are somewhat similar. So I'm going to mix them up. One of them is about your process when writing historical fiction. What's that process like? And the other one, she's interested in having a little bit more details into what that research and what that writing is like when you're starting out a book, such as The Most Beautiful Girl in Cuba.
Okay, so that one was a little bit different. I mentioned my process is a little different with each book. I'll just kind of explain with Havana and with When We Left Cuba, I had a pretty strong foundation, I think, as most Cuban Americans do, of that history. And so I was able to start diving into the book and then research as I went, because I very much knew the story I wanted to tell based on my family's stories, based on the events that had influenced them. With The Last Train to Key West, I mentioned that I jumped in and started writing and then researched as I went. And that was challenging, especially being on such a short timeline, where it was really unforgiving in terms of, if I had my characters, one of the issues was the ferry schedule. So with this book, the ferry stopped running at a certain point because of the storm warning. And there's a scene where Helen is on a ferry, and I had it in a different part of the book, and I actually had to move it because I realized the ferry would not have been running at that time. And I realize that's a really nitpicky thing, but that very much bothers me, and I try really hard to fit the accurate part of the storyline as much as possible. So that was kind of an example of a research issue I ran into. With The Most Beautiful Girl in Cuba, I really front-loaded my research. So I would say I researched pretty much full-time, like a 9 to 5, maybe for like 5 months every day. So it was a lot. And it almost got to a point where I had to tell myself, you have to start writing, because we have delivery deadlines when books are due. And I knew how much time I had to draft the book. And I was like, okay, I could read about this subject forever. And at some point I need to start writing. And then if I have to come back to things, I can. With The Most Beautiful Girl in Cuba, what I did was a lot of note taking. So I would go through lots of the figures in the book, like Hearst and Pulitzer, quite a bit has been written about them. And so I would go through their biographies or pieces that had been written about them. And I would parse out the details that I needed for the time period that I was writing about. And I just had like a master list in my Scrivener document where I would put all of my research. And it's really nice because with that program, you can break it up by character. So for example, I'd have a tab for Hearst, and everything I had researched for Hearst would be in there. And then when I would write, I would have that information to kind of cross-reference. Do these facts make sense? You know, is this how people would have described his personality or his appearance? And I found that really helpful. I didn't do a timeline for that book. I probably wish I had. There are some programs where you can do like actual timelines, and I think that would have been really helpful because there were a lot of big events in The Most Beautiful Girl in Cuba that were historically, you know, significant and recorded. But yeah, that's really just kind of how the process goes for me. As I've mentioned, I'm not a huge plotter. I actually created a character probably halfway through writing The Most Beautiful Girl in Cuba. I've mentioned how amazing my editor is. And I emailed her and I was like, I need another character in this book to do what I want to do. Is that okay if I add this character in storyline? And she said yes. And so I went back in and added a character. But really, it's just a lot of trial and error. I mean, it's often like you're working with a Rubik's Cube, particularly when you have different timelines or different points of view. And so you're constantly shifting things and moving around to see where, you know, it needs to go for the story. I usually write in a continuous draft, so I don't really edit as I go. I just write it all out there, and then I print it out, and I do a lot of revision rounds. That's where I really find that I polish the story and it starts to shine. And then obviously send it to my editor, and we go back and forth on edits as well.
Wow, I love that answer. Do you teach anywhere?
I don't know. And I feel like I have a weird writing process, so I don't know if I would be great about teaching it.
I think you'd be great.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you. I've just found what works for me, I guess. So
yeah. No, I know a lot about people teaching creative writing, so I think you'd be great. But I have some more questions for you from our audience. And one of them has to do with the Perez family. They want to know if in your future books you're going to be writing a lot more about the women, the Perez women in your books.
So right now, that is my plan. The Most Beautiful Girl in Cuba has 3 heroines. One of them is a Perez heroine. It was interesting to get to go back to that early of a time period in their history. So she's related to the family, and that was really fascinating. Right now, I am in the very beginning stages of my 2022 release, which will also feature some members of the Perez family. And I think we're going to see one of the sisters come back. So there will be a timeline in the 60s. And I think it's going to be Isabel, whose story is going to come out in that one. So right now, I do anticipate kind of following the family through history. I really like to change things up with my books. I like to have different settings, different time periods. I spend so much time researching and writing that it kind of keeps it fresh for me. So I'm liking this idea of, if I'm drawn to an event, looking at how it can relate to this family that I've grown to love and how I can bring them into the story.
That sounds great. And I have, I think, one last question. And if the person who wrote it wants to add any clarification, I'm going to try and do it justice. But the question is, what differences in approach would you or do you have when writing about being part of the Cuban diaspora, Cuban American in particular, and being Cuban, not Americanized? I think what this particular person is trying to get at, possibly, like how do you think about being Cuban American in terms of maintaining, a real connection to your roots? I think you did touch upon that a little bit earlier, but I don't know if you want to elaborate.
Oh, absolutely. I'll be honest, when I was writing Next Year in Havana, that was probably the thing that was the most frightening for me because it was the part where I was the most vulnerable. I think that when you write about identity, and especially when it's so personal, when you're writing about your family and your connection to them, it's obviously very emotional, and you feel like you're kind of laying yourself out on the page, which can be daunting. And I kind of joke sometimes that I think if I'd known so many people were going to read Next Year in Havana, I don't know if I would have been as personal as I was. A lot of the identity questions that Marisol has, a lot of her memories of her grandmother, the connection between them were very much things that were very personal to me and were very much kind of me speaking through her character. So for me, it really is just a personal exercise in kind of learning more about where I come from, learning more about my family, and also trying to figure out, what that identity means for me as a Cuban American. I mean, I obviously, for a lot of us in this generation, we have this strange situation where we don't have a tangible connection to a place. We didn't grow up in Cuba necessarily, but our father or our mother or our grandparents did. And we've sort of been entrusted with a lot of their memories and their love for their homeland, and that family history. And it's really important to me when I think about, and I always get emotional, I'm so sorry. But when I think about that passion that the generations have that went through the revolution and who came to this country and all that they sacrificed and all that they went through, I very much feel kind of an obligation, at least with my family, to try to keep that as alive as I can and to pass it on to subsequent generations, and to not have that culture and those memories and that history be erased, because you don't have that physical connection. And so it's something I think I'm still kind of growing into and understanding about myself, and finding where my comfort is with it, in terms of my writing. But I've really enjoyed it. And obviously, my books are very much from the perspective of someone who grew up in an exile household. And, I know that is going to inform my point of view, and it's going to come through in my characters, because that was such a formative part of my life.
Yes, I think that's true for a lot of, hyphenated Americans whose family
Yes.
come from other places. I know that one of the members of the audience asked what part of Cuba was your grandmother or your family from?
She was from Havana. They both were. And so that's why, Next Year in Havana takes place there, and why it was so important for me to kind of set that book there.
And we do have a number of other folks in the audience who Yvette Urosky mentioned that she read this book with her mom, and that it opened up a lot of conversations between the two of them that led to a greater understanding of their family history. And
I have to say, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that has honestly been the most incredible part of this process for me. We were speaking earlier in the green room. My younger years were spent in Gainesville. And back in the 80s and 90s, there was not a big Cuban community up there. I mean, I think my grandparents were friends with like every Cuban in Gainesville. But it wasn't like living in Miami, where you had this thriving community and amazing restaurants, and you really had this connection to your culture. So for me, my sense of being Cuban really just came from my immediate family. But what's been so special to me with these books is the conversations that I've been able to be part of. That's part of why I always love coming to Books and Books so much, because I have the best events and people share their stories. And it's always so incredible to hear kind of the common experiences. I mean, obviously, the Cuban exile community is not a monolith. Everyone has their own unique perspectives and experiences, and yet there are all these kind of hallmarks and I think shorthands you get to have when you're talking, where you can relate to each other in a way that is certainly very special. And hearing everyone's stories has really just kind of broadened my understanding of the history and where I come from, and definitely given me a renewed appreciation. So I love this dialogue, and I love hearing from readers that they're talking to their families about it, that they're learning something new. It's definitely really made me be able to relate to a lot of Cuban Americans from my generation who I think are grappling with some of the same issues of, where your identity fits when you're not physically connected to a place.
Yeah. So I do have one more question that was just posted. It's and this is from Erin Galloway. She says, you mentioned people wouldn't believe that the story of your next heroine is true. In your research, do you find that there are a lot of incredible women throughout history that don't get enough recognition for the things they've done?
I absolutely do. And that's one of my favorite things about writing historical fiction. I mean, so often we see that the historical record is really centered on men and men's stories, or a certain viewpoint or a certain storyline. And so being able to tell the stories that don't get as much attention is really fascinating to me. And that's what I really enjoy researching. It's so interesting too, because I'm sure Renee has experienced this as well. I think one of the criticisms you often hear for historical fiction writers is that we're being informed by modernity, and we're coming at our stories from a modern perspective, and this can't be historically accurate. But when you look at the historical record, I mean, there are these extraordinary women who were doing extraordinary things well over 100 years ago and even further off than that. And so it's almost like we've forgotten some of that a little bit, I think. She's not really a character in the book, but The Most Beautiful Girl in Cuba is set during the same time period that Nellie Bly lived. And she was a very prominent, very famous journalist in New York City. And I mean, the things she did back then were extraordinary. At one time, she was going to take a regiment of female soldiers down to Cuba to participate in the fighting and to help the Cubans in the fight for independence against Spain. And, to think that in 1896, women were talking about that, is not something I think our modern conception of history often affords. But definitely you find things like that in the record. And those are the gems that you just, once you get them, you seize on them and that's a story you want to tell.
That's so wonderful. Well, a number of the folks attending want the books to be made into movies. And actually a gentleman, Philip, just staged an adaptation of Ana Menendez's Baseball Dreams. It's a short story. Ana Menendez is a writer. She actually lives here in Miami. He's wondering if you would ever be interested in a stage adaptation of your work. So we have someone who wants to put you on stage and everybody who wants to put you in the movies. So how's that going? You got an agent?
I do. I would love to see these stories brought to life. We were really fortunate that we optioned next year in Havana for a TV series. So things are in the works with that. Obviously, the process from option to seeing it on television is quite long and twisty, and who knows, how it'll all end up. But there's a very passionate team that's attached to the project. And I'm really thrilled to see what they come up with. And, fingers crossed, something could come through and we could see this family brought to life on the screen.
Really, this is very exciting. I don't have any additional questions, but we still have a few minutes.
I've got a couple more questions for Chanel, if that's okay. I would really love, I always love hearing the advice that other writers give to, whether it's an aspiring writer or somebody who's more seasoned, but what advice and tips would you give?
I think the most important kind of starting block is to have a passion for books. I didn't really see myself writing until more recently. We were talking about this actually in the green room as well. My degrees are in politics, and then I have a law degree. And growing up in a Cuban family, the idea of me being a writer was not really what my grandparents and my dad had in mind. They definitely saw me doing something different. I think writing is a little unpredictable, and they wanted something a little more stable for me. So for me, the thing that really propelled me to be a writer was my love of books. I cannot remember a time in my life when I wasn't a reader, when books weren't getting me through, whatever difficulties I was facing. And I think that passion is really what sustains you. Writing can be a tough industry. You get a lot of no's at the beginning. You get a lot of no's as you're going. There's a lot of self-doubt. I think we're all probably pretty neurotic. And so having that passion and that love for stories and for books really drives you. So I definitely think that's always a good starting point, to read as much as you can, to love books and what you're doing in the storytelling. And then I think also perseverance is just really, really important. There were a lot of times I wanted to give up. There will probably still be times I want to give up, but you just have to kind of keep going and believe in yourself and, just keep pushing until it happens.
What was it like when you got the call about Reese Witherspoon? That had to have just been amazing.
It really was. It was absolutely a life-changing moment. If I'm being perfectly candid, it came at a time when I had a lot of self-doubt about my writing. And I wasn't sure, you have those ups and downs in your careers. And I was kind of like, I don't know where this is going to go. And I was actually at the post office. It was very not glamorous. And I just got an email and there were all these exclamation points in the subject line. And I opened it up and found that out. And my agent immediately called me. Renee and I share an agent. That's part of how we connected. We have the same publisher and we have the same agent. And our agent is amazing. And she was in tears. I was in tears. She's been with me for 8 years now, and she's been through all the ups and downs in the career. And it was just really special to share that. And with everyone at Berkeley and on my publishing team, my editor, and everyone who's been so incredibly supportive of my work.
I'm seeing a couple more questions that are being put in the chat, so I'm going to ask those. What about Spanish? Some of our readers have families who are dying to read you, but they don't speak English or don't read it as well.
That is honestly like my number one thing for next year in Havana and for my books. That's on my list of things I want. I also have that where a lot of my family reads in Spanish, and I would love nothing more for them to be published in Spanish. We have sold Next Year in Havana to a Spanish publisher. I don't have any more information on a release date or anything, but that's the thing I ask my publisher all the time, to be honest. They're probably like, stop asking that question. But no, I am with all of you, and I promise as soon as I hear anything, I will definitely share that. I'm really excited to see it in Spanish. That would mean a great deal to me.
And there are many, many folks who want to know what happens next with Luis and Marisol. So they want to know when you're going to continue their story in Miami.
So right now I don't have plans really to continue their story. I kind of left them, as we all know, in kind of an interesting moment in Cuban American relations and Cuba. And I think right now I'm still kind of waiting to see how everything turns out and if there would be a story for them and what that story would look like. Right now I'm really enjoying kind of writing historical fiction, so going back to the past more. But I very much love them. I mean, Marisol is a very personal character for me. I mean, in a lot of ways, she's very similar to me. And it was a really great way for me to kind of get to explore my feelings on a lot of things. So definitely, I think of them often, and I don't know if I'll revisit, but, never say never. So.
This has been so wonderful. I just want to remind everyone that both Renee's and Chanel's books are available at booksandbooks.com. Shipping is very fast. We prefer that all of you purchase your books from Books and Books because it's our independent bookstore, and we need to keep our bookstores going well into the future and well past this situation we find ourselves in. And I just want to thank everyone for coming. I know that, it's a little bit unusual what we're going through, but I really do find, and I know Chanel and Renee also, because we were talking about it, we really do find that so many more people can participate. That, maybe when we all go back to being in person, we'll also have everything live streamed at the same time. Again, thank you both so much for being part of Miami Book Fair's events, Books and Books events. You've been wonderful. And I think everyone, is really happy with the way things have gone. Purchase your book. And if you guys want to say a few last words before Crowdcast takes us away.
Do you want to say anything first, Renee? Yeah, go ahead.
I'll just say that it's really been a privilege for me to help participate in this, and I think that your readers are in for such a treat with this book. You keep getting better and better with each one, and I'm just thrilled for you.
Well, thank you, and thank you so much for coming tonight, Renee. We talk about writing being kind of a solitary endeavor, and the friendships you make with other authors are so special. We just had it earlier today, and it always feels so nice to catch up. So I'm so thrilled we could be here. And I highly recommend Renee's Park Avenue Summer if you're looking for a fabulous summer read. And then thank you so much to Books and Books and the Miami Book Fair for having me. I don't think I can start my tours off anywhere else now because I always just feel so warm and so welcomed here. And thank you all so much for coming tonight. I love hearing from you. I love hearing your thoughts on the books and the characters, and I love hearing your stories about your families that you share with me. It's really one of the most special parts of my job, and I'm just so honored, and I appreciate that you let these characters into your lives and all the support you've shown me in my books.
Thank you. Thank you both.
Thank you.